I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped outside and saw my hedge, the 7-foot wall of green privacy I'd spent 5 years growing, shaved down to a pathetic 2-foot stump like some butchered crime scene, and the only thought running through my mind was, the HOA finally snapped, and now it was my turn to snap back. The air still smelled of fresh clippings, and when I walked closer, I saw the tracks of a landscaping crew tires imprinted right across my flower beds, as if they wanted to stomp their dominance into the soil. My phone began buzzing with HOA notifications at the exact same time, as though they were proud of what they had done, and the first message from HOA President Karen herself proudly declared, "Your hedges violated height code and blocked the lake view for other residents. We have corrected it. You're welcome. You're welcome." I stood there, shaking, staring at the massacre of branches that used to shield my porch from the snobby Lakeview fanatics who believed they were entitled to see everything on the horizon, including the privacy of neighbors like me. My neighbor, Sam, whispered from across the lawn, "They did it at 6 a.m. They didn't even knock." Karen said it's common property. Common property, another lie they loved. The hedge was on my land. Planted by me. Watered by me. Cared for by me. But the HOA had been salivating over this view enforcement policy for months, trying to turn the neighborhood into some luxury resort for their greedy plans. As I walked the full length of the butchered hedge, fury rising with every step, I felt the sun hit my porch in a way it never had before. Harsh, direct, intrusive, and I realized just how exposed I now was. My backyard, once hidden from the constant judgment of HOA binoculars, was now fully open like a stage. And like actors ready to gossip, 2 board members stood across the street pretending not to stare. That's when Karen herself strutted over in her oversized sunglasses, HOA clipboard clutched like a scepter. "You should thank us," she said, smirking. "Now the neighbors can finally see the lake." I stared straight into her reflective lenses and replied, "Funny, because now you've given me the motivation to build something a lot taller." She scoffed. "If you rebuild that hedge, we'll fine you $500 a day." I didn't blink. Who said anything about hedges? Because right then, in the heat of anger and humiliation, the idea hit me like thunder. If they wanted their precious lake view so badly, I would make sure they'd never see it again. Not an inch. Not a sliver. Not a shimmer of water. That afternoon, after fuming for hours, I drove out to an industrial scrapyard and made a deal that shocked even the old man running the place. By sundown, I had 3 massive, dented, rusty cargo containers being delivered to my driveway, each one tall enough to wipe out the lake view from every house on the street. My plan wasn't just retaliation, it was poetic justice in metal form. When the truck rumbled into the neighborhood, neighbors gathered like it was a crime scene unfolding live. Karen sprinted toward my driveway, arms flapping wildly. "You can't place those here," she screeched. "This violates every HOA regulation." I simply smiled. "These are temporary storage units for a project. Completely legal under Section 4B of your own handbook. Want me to show you?" Her face drained of color because she knew I was right. So I watched with the calmest satisfaction as the crane lowered the first container into place, directly blocking the lake view her elite committee treasured more than their own spouses. Then the second. Then the third. When the metal boomed into the ground, the echo rang down the street like the sound of vengeance being delivered. The containers formed a towering rust-colored wall, turning their beloved scenic view into a gritty industrial backdrop. Karen's jaw dropped as neighbors gasped. My revenge was just beginning. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that this move would not only expose the HOA's corruption but trigger a chain of events that would make the entire neighborhood turn on Karen, and reveal a secret the HOA had been hiding for years. The next morning, as the first sunlight hit the jagged edges of the rusty containers I'd installed, I realized the neighborhood had descended into chaos faster than a wildfire in July, and the moment I stepped outside, I was greeted with a mixture of awe, fear, and fury that hung in the air thicker than the morning fog over the lake. Parents holding their children back, HOA board members pacing like caged lions, and a small crowd of neighbors whispering behind their hands, some of them secretly smiling while others looked ready to call the police at the slightest provocation. Karen was the first to storm up my driveway, red-faced and shouting every rule she could think of, waving her clipboard like it was a magic wand that could undo my perfectly legal placement of the containers, and as I calmly explained again, with citations from the HOA handbook and local zoning laws, That every single container was within my rights, and that they had zero authority to dictate the use of my property in this manner, she began sputtering, her usual confidence cracking like old paint under the sun. But while Karen flailed, the real spectacle unfolded across the street. Mr. Thompson, the HOA treasurer, had pulled his SUV halfway onto the sidewalk in a panic, apparently fearing the towering metal walls might somehow topple, even though each container was anchored securely with industrial-grade supports. From my porch, I could see Mrs. Daniels taking selfies with the containers in the background, posting them immediately to the neighborhood Facebook group with captions like, HOA meltdown, the rust strikes back, and Karen can't handle reality. Meanwhile, a few kids had climbed onto their bikes to circle the driveway, adding the soundtrack of squealing tires and laughter to the scene, and I realized I hadn't even begun to fully exploit the leverage I now had. Karen, in an almost desperate move, threatened fines, towing, and even legal action, but I knew the HOA's own history of failed lawsuits and overturned citations gave me the upper hand. I could see the fear in her eyes, the kind of fear that comes when someone realizes their control is slipping, and that realization fueled a cunning idea in my mind. If they think I'm done, I'm not even close. That evening, under the cover of twilight, I returned to the driveway with a toolbox, some chains, and a few hundred spikes, because the containers were only the beginning. I wanted to make sure their view would remain obstructed until they begged for mercy. As I reinforced the corners and added the spikes, I overheard Karen on her phone, whispering furiously to the HOA lawyer about immediate action and injunctions, and I smirked, knowing that the legal team had no clue I had already checked every loophole, clause, and regulation, and that even their best lawyer would struggle to remove a single container without admitting they had no grounds. The following morning, the neighborhood woke to a surreal sight. The containers gleamed rustily in the sun, their looming shadows cutting off the horizon like industrial monoliths, and the reactions were instantaneous. Some neighbors cheered quietly, nodding to each other in conspiratorial delight, while others ran to their phones to call Karen and complain, not realizing their complaints would bounce right off the legal shields I had erected. But then the situation escalated beyond my expectations. A drone appeared above the street, apparently dispatched by Karen to document the containers for evidence, and as the camera whirred, I realized the footage would do more than help her. It would expose every secret violation the HOA had committed over the years. My mind raced, electricity lines buried without permits, landscaping destroyed for personal gain, fines issued illegally. And in that instant, I understood that this conflict wasn't just about a view. It was about control, power, and the sheer audacity of people who believed they could dictate someone else's life. That night, as Karen tried to rally a handful of loyal HOA supporters, I watched from my porch as whispers turned into arguments, arguments into accusations, and accusations into public breakdowns. By midnight, her leadership looked like a house of cards in a windstorm, and I knew the tipping point was near. But before I could savor the chaos fully, a loud crash from the far end of the street made me freeze. Headlights swung across my yard, revealing a figure moving toward the containers with a large crowbar, and a low, menacing voice shouted, "Take these down now, or I'll do it myself." I realized in horror that this wasn't just about the HOA anymore. Someone had taken matters into their own hands, and the consequences of what would happen next could spiral out of control faster than I could react. The night held its breath, the containers standing as silent witnesses, and I knew that tomorrow would either cement my victory or ignite a confrontation that no one in the neighborhood would ever forget. I didn't even have time to reach for my phone before the shadowy figure with the crowbar slammed it against the first rusty container, sending a metallic boom through the neighborhood so loud it sounded like an explosion, and in that split second, as the echo rattled down the street, I realized this wasn't just vandalism. This was someone trying to send me a message. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long distorted shadows across the pavement, and as I stepped closer to the intruder, the glint of the crowbar caught the light again, revealing the furious face of none other than HOA Vice President Mark, the man Karen used as her muscle whenever she needed something done that she didn't want to do herself. His eyes were wild, his breath ragged, and he kept swinging the crowbar with a reckless rage that made him look like he'd cracked under the pressure of the neighborhood chaos I'd unleashed. "You ruined everything," he screamed, denting the lower edge of the container. "The buyers are coming next week. You think this is about a view? You think this is about Hedges? You have no idea what you've interfered with. Buyers." The word froze me mid-step. What buyers? What plan? Before I could ask, Mark swung again, the crowbar slipping from his sweaty grip and clattering to the pavement. He lunged at the container with his bare hands like a desperate man trying to keep a secret from spilling out. At that exact moment, a porch light flicked on across the street and Sam appeared, holding a phone and yelling, "Stop! I'm recording this!" Mark staggered back as though the light itself burned him, his panicked eyes darting between us, and for a moment I saw something in his expression I had never associated with him before. Fear, deep, guilty, exposed fear. He didn't run far. He sprinted straight to Karen's house, banging on her door until she flung it open. Even from my distance, I could hear their frantic whispers as she dragged him inside, slamming the door behind them like they were barricading themselves from the truth. I replayed his words in my head, "The buyers are coming next week." Suddenly, so much made sense: the aggressive rule enforcement, the obsession with view uniformity, the forced landscaping, the secret closed-door HOA meetings. They weren't beautifying the neighborhood. They were preparing it for a sale. A massive sale. But of what? The next morning, the answer began to reveal itself. A convoy of expensive black SUVs rolled into the community, their tinted windows reflecting the containers like a wall of defiance, and out stepped three sharply dressed individuals who looked more like corporate auditors than homebuyers. They didn't even glance at my house. They marched straight to Karen's driveway. The entire neighborhood watched from behind curtains and half-open doors as Karen, Mark, and the treasurer hurriedly led the group inside like they were hiding state secrets. And maybe they were. For 2 long hours, the SUVs stayed parked like silent sentinels while muffled voices echoed from inside the house. When the group finally emerged, their expressions were stiff, serious, disappointed. One of the men pointed directly at my containers while speaking sternly to Karen, and I could practically feel the heat of her humiliation as they got back into their SUVs and drove off without so much as a handshake. Karen didn't come out for the rest of the day, but her silence said more than her shouting ever had. That night, Sam came by with a revelation of his own. "You know the old lakefront parcels? The land on the lower edge of the water?" he asked, glancing around before leaning closer. "I heard from a friend at the county office. The HOA has been trying to sell access rights to a hotel chain." My jaw clenched. So that was it. They wanted the lake view not for the residents, but for investors. A hotel. A resort. A development that would change the neighborhood forever. And my hedges, my privacy, were in their way. The containers had ruined their big deal. Now they were desperate. And desperate people do stupid things. Just past midnight, I noticed strange movement near the containers, shadows flickering, whispers, the faint glow of flashlights zigzagging along the metal surfaces. I grabbed my phone and zoomed in. 3 figures. One of them unmistakably Karen. Another holding what looked like a stack of documents. The third carrying gasoline. My stomach dropped. Karen wasn't trying to file legal action. She wasn't trying to negotiate. She was about to erase the problem, literally, by setting the containers on fire. My containers weren't just blocking her view now. They were blocking her corruption, her secret deals, her future profit. So she had one solution left: destroy everything before I could expose her. I ran toward them as fast as I could, shouting her name at the top of my lungs. They all froze, their flashlights whipping toward me. The man with the gasoline panicked first and dropped the can, spilling fuel across the gravel. Karen screamed, "Don't let him record us!" And a fourth figure, someone I hadn't noticed hiding behind the corner, stepped out holding something much worse than a crowbar, a lit match. The night air tightened. The gasoline shimmered. My heart slammed against my ribs. And before I could take another step, the match holder flicked their wrist, sending the burning ember arcing through the air directly toward the trail of gasoline at Karen's feet. The instant I saw the ember arc through the air, time seemed to stretch, a slow-motion nightmare as the tiny spark fell onto the gasoline trail, and instinct took over. I lunged forward, grabbed a fire extinguisher from my porch, and blasted it with a roar that drowned out Karen's scream and the crackle of impending fire, sending the match holder stumbling back and sparks scattering harmlessly across the gravel. But in those heart-pounding seconds, I realized the confrontation had escalated. Far beyond Hedges, containers, or even the lake view, this was life or death, exposing corruption, greed, and a complete breakdown of the HOA's authority, and my blood hammered in my ears as I assessed the chaos. Karen frozen in shock, Mark panting and muttering about ruined deals, the treasurer clutching his head in disbelief, and neighbors peeking from their windows like a crowd of voyeurs witnessing a gladiator arena. With a deep breath, I stepped between them and the containers, towering rust-colored walls that now symbolized both defiance and protection, and I calmly, deliberately, laid out everything I had uncovered. Their secret plan to sell lake access to a hotel chain, the falsified documents they'd filed, the illegal landscaping, the fines that violated their own rules, everything that proved the HOA was corrupt to the core. I could see Karen's face pale with each word, the arrogance that had fueled her smirk now melting into panic as the reality of exposure hit. Sam's phone was recording everything, live-streaming to the neighborhood group, and I knew that once the video went online, there would be no way for them to manipulate the story. The evidence was undeniable, the containers stood as silent witnesses, and every neighbor would see the truth. Karen started screaming, trying to regain control, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of more neighbors arriving, drawn by the commotion, many of them carrying cameras, cell phones, and even a few legal documents they had dug up after I had dropped subtle hints about the HOA's misconduct. Within minutes, the front of the street transformed into a full-blown accountability rally. Neighbors confronting the board, questioning their decisions, and demanding transparency while I stood back, a grin forming, letting the chaos unfold exactly as I had envisioned. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very metal containers that Karen had hated now served as a barrier protecting my property, my privacy, and exposing her corruption at the same time. Just as I began to feel a fleeting sense of victory, a sharp horn blared from the entrance of the neighborhood. A fleet of official-looking vehicles pulling up, red and blue lights reflecting off the containers and the surrounding houses. My heart skipped. The police. Or something bigger. Officers and inspectors poured out, their expressions unreadable, and the lead officer held up a warrant that mentioned investigations into fraudulent HOA activity, illegal land deals, and safety violations. Karen's mouth dropped open, Mark froze, and even the treasurer looked like he'd swallowed a brick. The officer stepped forward, glancing at me, and said, "We've been tracking this HOA for months. Your actions brought them into the light. You might have just saved the neighborhood from massive fraud." Relief and adrenaline collided, but there was no time to celebrate. Karen lunged toward me, screaming about fines, lawsuits, and ruined reputations, but a firm hand from a police officer stopped her mid-step, and the reality hit her. Her power had evaporated. The containers that had been her nightmare were now her public exposure, the embodiment of her greed, and the protective shield for every honest neighbor who had tolerated her tyranny for too long. As the officers escorted Karen, Mark, and the treasurer away, whispers of thanks, admiration, and even laughter rippled through the crowd. The neighbors began approaching me, shaking hands, some even hugging, grateful that finally someone had stood up, taken a calculated risk, and fought back. By the end of the night, the street was calm but forever changed, the containers still looming, the once violated hedge space reclaimed as a safe boundary, and a sense of justice settling like a heavy, satisfying blanket over the neighborhood. I stepped onto my porch, looked out at the sunset reflecting off the lake, the same view Karen had coveted, and realized that this victory was about more than just blocking a view or fighting an HOA. It was about reclaiming power, standing up to corruption, and reminding everyone that rules are meant to protect, not to oppress. And as I sat there, exhausted but triumphant, I knew one undeniable truth. If you dare to challenge greed with intelligence, patience, and audacity, even the most powerful people can crumble. And sometimes, rusty containers are exactly the justice they deserve. Just when I thought the neighborhood had finally settled, a new wave of chaos hit like a storm surge. At dawn, the sound of a massive truck rumbling up my driveway made every window shutter rattle, and I knew immediately that this wasn't ordinary. Someone had escalated, testing the limits of my bold stand against the HOA, and my heart thudded in my chest as I ran to the porch to witness the unfolding madness. Towering behind the containers was a brand-new, state-of-the-art crane attached to a flatbed carrying a shipping container twice the size of the ones I had installed, painted a blinding corporate white and stamped with the logo of a construction company I had never seen before. The message was clear. They weren't done, and they wanted me to know that this was war. Karen, who had somehow been released on bail after the previous night's police action, sprinted alongside the truck, waving a sheaf of legal papers, shouting that I had violated emergency regulations and that this container would be placed forcibly if I didn't comply. But as she ran, her footing betrayed her on the gravel, and she stumbled, scraping her elbows and face, a physical metaphor for the unraveling control she had clung to for years. I stood my ground, arms crossed, watching her panic unfold as the truck came to a halt just short of my containers. The driver, a silent man in a reflective vest, stepped down, gave me a polite nod, and whispered, "We've been hired to test your claim. The HOA is desperate." Desperate. That word hit me like lightning, the same desperation that had led Karen, Mark, and the treasurer to try arson just days ago. I realized then that the neighborhood wasn't just a community anymore. It was a battlefield, and every resident watching from behind curtains or through binoculars had become a silent witness to the battle lines drawn with rust, steel, and unwavering defiance. I decided to act fast, not with violence, but with strategy. Using the very leverage Karen had underestimated, I called the county zoning office and the city inspectors, inviting them over to verify the legal placement and safety of my containers. Within an hour, a team of officials arrived, walking the property, checking permits, measurements, and codes, and when they confirmed everything was fully compliant, the tension in the street turned palpable. Neighbors who had been secretly rooting for Karen's removal began whispering among themselves, openly discussing what they'd seen and the corruption that had festered in their community for years. Karen screamed, flailed, and attempted to rally a few desperate HOA loyalists, but the momentum had shifted completely. Meanwhile, I took the opportunity to speak directly to the construction truck driver, calmly explaining that if he attempted to place that massive container on my property without permission, it would be considered trespassing, and the liability would fall squarely on whoever hired him. The driver's eyes widened. He hadn't expected someone to be so composed under pressure, and he nodded silently, retreating to his cab. By mid-morning, word had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The containers weren't going anywhere, the HOA had lost all credibility, and any future attempts to intimidate me would be recorded, documented, and challenged legally. Neighbors began approaching me cautiously, asking questions about their own rights, about fines they'd been issued, and about whether they could finally reclaim their voice in the HOA meetings, many confiding that they'd felt powerless for years. I realized then that my fight had created a ripple effect, inspiring everyone around me. Karen, seeing the tide of public opinion turn irreversibly, finally slumped onto her porch steps, clutching her head and mumbling about ruined plans, lost deals, and the humiliation she had suffered. And just when I thought the crisis had fully subsided, my phone buzzed with an anonymous tip. A large development company was now looking to acquire the entire HOA's land for a massive resort project, the very project Karen had secretly hoped to expedite, and which my containers had delayed long enough for the truth to emerge. My mind raced. This was far from over. The HOA might be crippled, but the corporate sharks circling our neighborhood weren't. Yet, for the first time, I felt an exhilarating certainty. I had the upper hand. I had leverage, evidence, and the full support of the neighbors who had once cowered in silence. And as I stood on my porch, watching the sun glint off the towering rusted containers that had started as a simple act of revenge but had now become monuments of justice, I made a silent vow. I would protect this neighborhood, expose every bit of corruption, and turn any attempt to manipulate or intimidate us into a public spectacle, using the same ingenuity, audacity, and courage that had saved us all from Karen's grasp. Because sometimes, victory isn't about hiding behind laws or waiting for someone else to act. It's about taking bold, calculated action and showing the world that no one, not even an all-powerful HOA, can trample on the rights of those willing to stand their ground. And as the breeze rustled the metal walls of the containers, I knew this was only the beginning of a new era of empowerment for our street, one where audacity, courage, and smart defiance would always be stronger than greed, entitlement, and fear. The morning after the official inspection, as I sipped my coffee on the porch and watched the sun rise over the lake that Karen and her HOA had once tried to claim as their own, a low hum in the distance caught my attention. A fleet of black drones, sleek and silent, weaving through the trees like mechanical predators, and my stomach sank because this was no ordinary surveillance. Someone was watching me, analyzing every move, every placement of my containers, every step I took, and the realization hit hard. The battle for control of the neighborhood was escalating into something far beyond simple revenge or HOA politics. I grabbed my binoculars just in time to see the drones converge near the far end of the street, hovering over the undeveloped parcels where Karen had secretly been planning her luxury lakefront resort, and then it clicked. These weren't just investors, builders, or curious neighbors. They were reconnaissance drones, likely sent by the development company I had been tipped about, assessing the landscape, the obstacles I had placed, and my patterns of behavior. My mind raced as I realized that my audacious act of blocking the view had inadvertently put me in direct conflict with a powerful, faceless corporation whose resources could overwhelm any individual. Yet the same audacity that had given me the upper hand with Karen's petty corruption could be leveraged again, if I acted smart. I raced to the driveway, signaling Sam and a few neighbors who had grown bold enough to stand with me, and we began a coordinated effort to document every drone flight, every angle of observation, and every footprint left by the previous night's chaos. Karen's voice echoed from across the street, muffled but unmistakable, screaming that I was escalating things beyond reason, while secretly she was no doubt terrified that this new development could expose her own complicity in the scheme. By noon, the drone fleet had grown, and I could see at least 5 hovering over strategic vantage points, their lenses glinting ominously in the sun. That's when my plan hit me. If they were going to surveil us, I could turn the tables. Using reflective panels scavenged from my garage, mirrors, and even the shiny surfaces of the containers themselves, I began creating a chaotic visual maze designed to confuse the drone sensors, refracting sunlight and triggering their cameras to focus on false targets. Meanwhile, I enlisted a few neighbors to document every move, creating a digital record that could serve as irrefutable evidence if these drones were ever used for intimidation or corporate spying. The next moment, an SUV screeched into the street, tinted windows, menacing black exterior, and Karen herself stepped out, flanked by 2 suited men I didn't recognize. Her usual confidence was replaced with an almost desperate determination, and she barked orders at the men while glaring at me, as though sheer anger could reverse the chaos she had orchestrated. The suited men approached cautiously, clearly aware that my containers were not only legally compliant but strategically placed to maximize visibility over the entire street, and as they circled the metal walls, I noticed one of them checking his smartwatch nervously, clearly counting down to some prearranged action. I knew instantly. This was a corporate escalation, a private attempt to intimidate me into compliance, and if I miscalculated, things could turn dangerous fast. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward and shouted across the street, "Everything you're planning is being recorded. Every step, every document, every drone is being documented and reported. Stop now or face consequences you can't control." The intensity in my voice seemed to give my neighbors courage, as several emerged from their homes, cameras in hand, standing firmly behind the barricade of containers, united as a street against external pressure. Karen's face twisted in fury, her lips trembling as she attempted to speak, but the wind carried my words clearly to her and her men, and for a moment I saw a flicker of uncertainty in their otherwise calculated composure. Then, as if on cue, one of the drones faltered, its camera lens reflecting sunlight from my mirror setup, spinning wildly and triggering a low alarm. Another drone swooped closer, investigating, and I realized the moment had arrived. I could force them into a tactical retreat without firing a shot, relying solely on ingenuity, community, and a well-planned environment. Just as I moved to signal my neighbors to activate the final set of mirrors, a sudden screech of tires and a loud crash echoed from the opposite side of the street. One of the black SUVs had collided with a dumpster in a panicked attempt to escape the drone's confusing signals, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Karen screamed, lunging toward the vehicle to salvage it, and I realized that the chaos had shifted irrevocably in my favor. But even in this moment of triumph, a chilling thought struck me. If these corporate forces were willing to escalate with drones and SUVs, what other surprises did they have hidden up their sleeves, and was the neighborhood truly safe? Or had I just bought us a temporary reprieve before an even larger storm arrived? The air was thick with tension, the sun glinting off the rusted containers like an industrial warning, and as the drones retreated, the SUV sped away, and Karen collapsed onto the street in defeat. I knew one truth with absolute certainty. The battle for our street had only begun, and the next move, whether from corporate power, corrupt HOA remnants, or unexpected allies, would decide not just my victory, but the fate of every neighbor who had dared to take a stand.